Hello, everyone. How are you doing? This is Damon Osa Cunningham coming to you with another episode of I'm Alive. Today, we are going to be talking about the Dahomey Empire. As many of you know, that Viola Davis has a new movie coming out called The Woman King. It is, I believe, a fictional, truth-inspired movie. They base it on some truth, but I'm sure, just like any Hollywood production, that there's going to be some Hollywoodized things, some things left out, some things added in. And we're here today to discuss the truth behind the Dahomey Empire. So we have two guests with us today. Our first guest is Kari Evans, who is the historian for the Historical African Martial Arts Association. And our second guest is researcher Don Cooks. So, Kari. Hey, Kari, how are you?
I'm good. Hey, everyone.
Hey, Don, how are you?
I'm doing good, brother. It's nice to see you guys.
As always. So I would like, basically, Kari, could you just start by giving us a general overview of the Dahomey Empire?
Okay, so the Kingdom of Dahomey, it was founded in the 17th century and lasted until 1904. They were a regional power that essentially they started off kind of being a tributary state or kind of under the control of other more powerful groups such as the Oyo. And then essentially, as the Oyo Empire started to decline, Dahomey was able to kind of take over the territory and become a regional power of itself. And the way they did this was really they were a militant kingdom. So they would, they wage wars against their neighbors and things like that. And they're known for basically being a very standardized professional army and state, where basically you have both the spiritual, political, and military sides of society all linked. And probably the most famous thing about the Dahomey is their, use of female soldiers. The Mino, meaning our mothers, who basically, the historians say they started off as elephant hunters that then got incorporated more and more into the structure of the Dahomey army under its third king. And basically, we have a lot of documentation from French and other European traders. And then later, when the kingdom got into conflict with the French, essentially accounts of the Mino in battle and things like that.
Okay. Don, would you like to give an overview of some things maybe Kari left out, or what you feel about the Dahomey?
So just adding on to what Brother Kari said, because he gave a really good overview. And as he mentioned at the beginning, Dahomey was under the yoke of other kingdoms in the region, especially the Oyo people. And this is very important to consider because for their entire existence, Dahomey was always warring against the Yorubas, who were the main ethnicity in the Oyo Empire. So one of their main things was getting out from under them, because they basically were the slaves of the Oyo kingdoms and their under their dominion. So when Dahomey really organized as Brother Kari mentioned, a very militaristic, very centralized state, their first order of business was kicking out the Oyo kingdom. And one of the things they also did is, as they established their power, they went around and enslaved the other local tribes and kingdoms that weren't as powerful as them. So I think that has to really be considered, is that for the Dahomey, slavery was something they were fighting against for themselves to get free, but something that they were also a very big participator in, as were a lot of other African societies at the time.
Okay. Sorry, folks. I'm having some technical problems here that I'm trying to deal with. Okay. So as a lot of you know, have seen, there is some negative feedback as well with this film. A lot of people are upset basically at the fact that the Dahomey, they feel, are being glorified because of that role in slavery that they had.
Right.
But so originally I was going to have this kind of be like a debate, the pros and the cons. But I figured we would just do fact-based presentation here and let people make up their own mind about it. One of the things that I've been responding to folks who say, what about slavery? What about slavery? They enslaved my ancestors. Well, chances are your ancestors enslaved someone as well. The Dahomey did not have a monopoly on the African, the slave trade in Africa, and many of of our ancestors also engaged in that. I know the Yoruba, the Oyo. I mean, it was the Oyo who started fighting with the Dahomey, which made them, grow to this. So, Kari, what would your response be to someone who said, what about the slavery?
I feel like, and part of it is just like the way the history is written or is told, kind of like you hear the full history. If you even get the full history, but you hear little tidbits, you don't really get a comprehensive like overview of what actually happened outside of like, a college setting or academic setting where you're already kind of invested in the interest. And what I would say about it is you really got to look at the complexity of these societies in the sense of this. You have the slave trade and you have these different kingdoms capturing, their neighbors, rival powers and stuff, and selling them for resources, textiles, alcohol, spirits, and firearms, most importantly. But then on the other hand, you have, well, as a people, if they don't do that, then they get in a situation where the next kingdom that does that is going to amass all of this power that you're not going to be able to combat. So it's the idea of one that it was something where a lot of groups participated, and there are some groups that didn't participate in it, but it's more complex than just these people sold these people, because it was more interdependent the way the whole system worked. And the second thing is you kind of have the catch-22 of the groups that weren't able to tap into that market didn't have enough power to defend themselves against groups that were. And so that's kind of, it's like you really got to look at it. And if you don't have the context of what was going on, you're really talking about a very turbulent time. You have kingdoms that have been around for centuries that are now gone or greatly diminished, or no longer influencing the region. And then you also have kingdoms that are expanding and growing faster than they ever had in their history, all mixed together with foreign powers basically influencing things from the coast. So I always argue for kind of getting a broader picture and trying to bring the complexity to it. But you have to focus on what exactly that was, because you can't put it in the periphery, because that's something a lot of these kingdoms were thinking about: how I'm going to get captives, how I'm going to establish control over the slave ports or the coastal areas. But at the same time, you don't want to demonize them in the sense of, if it was about Rome or Italy or any of these other, non-African civilizations, they don't really get picked through with that fine-tooth comb like that. So
that was exactly one of my points as well. Take Rome, for instance. Rome subjugated everybody they could. And we have a million, Rome movies. No one's complaining about, the slavery. It's not an issue when we're talking about Rome. No one cared about the, slaves when Gladiator came on, everybody grabbed the gladiators and ran out in the backyard and started hitting each other. There's a History Channel series on right now, the Colosseum. The Colosseum, every gladiator was a slave. The word slave comes from a Slavic region where Rome got so many of their enslaved people. And I mean, for the past, since there's been film, there's been Roman movies, since there's been film, we've watched 300 Spartans. They were another society built on slavery, but no one seems to care about that. Don, why do you think that it's such a big problem for mostly, honestly, African Americans, Americans of African descent, who feel this way?
Well, I think part of it, and this is a big problem with a lot of cases when we look back into stuff in history, is this idea that we're projecting our mentality now backwards. So say when you take Dahomey, for instance, it's erroneous to say that, oh, well, Dahomey went around enslaving their fellow Africans. Why are you talking about them? That's not looking at Dahomey as a civilization on its own terms. Back then, they weren't looking at it as enslaving their brothers or their sisters or whatever the case may be. For the Dahomeans, this was part of their world. This was part of their society. And I think especially for us as African Americans being descended from the slave trade, we have to be really careful when we're studying these areas, especially in a case like this, that we're not projecting our modern morality onto them if we want to truly understand what this is about and have the detachment to really effectively deal with it.
Okay. And I can say something to that too. I feel like also part of it is one thing I do see different from Rome is this is pretty modern history,
right?
In the sense of these groups still exist. The empires, the kingdoms that they built up might be gone, but the ethnicities and stuff, they haven't transformed into different groups and things like that. Like you have the Romans and stuff, where it's like you have modern Italy, you have all these other states, and so I don't want to go, and I feel like what it is it's like the history is not really understood because it's presented simplistically.
Right.
But at the same time, I understand because you're talking about this kingdom, but the result of that is all these people got shipped away or all this whatever. And it's like you said, not seeing them as their own civilization.
Right.
On the flip side, though, I feel like you should try to give a full picture of it because, one, I feel like this is history that still affects in the modern day more so than necessarily Roman history or some other histories, because it's so close to it. And now that you have all of these modern African states, some of them are, they're using, these empires and kingdoms of yesteryear as, to build up their national image and things like that. And so you have, when you have a history as complex as, the transatlantic slave trade, because it's at one thing, it's you built up all this, Dahomey, Ashanti, you built up all this power in a short amount of time, right? At the same time, though, the aftermath of that, you have the colonization of most of the continent. And so it's you have a fall and you have what you call a golden age right next to each other, After they go and they secure their area in the coastal land, then they start getting in conflict with the French after the Berlin Conference, So it's basically, right, you basically have this very condensed time period where you both see the rise and a fall. And so, all
right.
Huh? Sorry. Yeah, I think that's what it is.
Okay. So, well, let's get into some more of the history. Let's celebrate the military effects, the military tactics. How did I for one am definitely in support of this movie. It shows us in a positive light. It shows the martial capabilities. So you mentioned, Kari, that this force started the Dahomey female force started as female elephant hunters. Could you give us a little bit of information about that?
So the sources, they don't really go too deep into it, but basically they started. So there's kind of like within Dahomey, like spirituality, there's like the idea of like counterparts between like male and female and things like that. So you have these elephant hunters, and as you see in West Africa, hunters always have a lot of power in the society because one, like there's a thing like the ability to go and take out animals and things. You can put like a spiritual aspect to that, but then also hunters are people that are trained to use weapons, because to go out to hunt, you got to learn how to use the bow, you got to learn how to use the spear and things like that. And so even from if I'm raising an army, if I bring a hunter group in, they're going to come in at a higher level than random villager off the street. And so you see a lot of like hunter groups that basically get incorporated into the army at one point and quickly take on an elite status. And that's exactly what you see with the Mino. It comes from hunters so you think of hunting, there's a lot of skills that translate to the military, being able to live out in the wilderness, being able to capture and prepare game, be able to hunt game, because if you're hunting elephants and creatures that are smart, you have to have a strategy of how not to get trampled, how to sneak up on them in such a way that you can administer your shot and things. So these then play in when I'm doing raids or when I'm in battle, that that kind of hunter education comes in too, because it still applies. As soldiers, they talk about them basically trying to outcompete their male counterparts in all things. So, they train just as hard. They do drills. They have special dances they do when they perform with like their muskets and stuff like that. They march in line, because with them securing the coast, they're able to import a lot of European weapons and firearms. So really you're seeing like a modernized African army, where some of the older kingdoms or the surrounding regions were kind of, depending on how much access they could get to firearms, you would have a situation where old weapon systems and new, adopted firearms and things like that from the coast would kind of be used interchangeably. And then as the group gets more access, they kind of replace it completely with firearms. So like, if you're looking at the early time period, you would have mostly, you have people with shields, spears, javelins, bows, things like that. But then later on, as they get more access to firearms, which was going out throughout all the areas, you start seeing marching in file, using bayonets, sabers, things like that, and a more adopting European methods of warfare. And so the Mino kind of also go through that, where when you're talking about when they're fighting the French, they're basically musketeers.
Okay. Don, can you speak on the transition from the hunters to the king's wives? I believe they were initially. Like how did and who made that transition, if like which one of the rulers made that transition from hunters to bodyguards to elite unit?
Well, it was actually several other kings, and one of the most prominent was Gezo, who came relatively later on in the Dahomey kingdom. And the monarchs created these female units, like Brother Kari said. At first, it was doing the elephant hunting thing and what have you. But then they switched them to this professionalized military force. I mean, because keep in mind the beginning of our conversation that Dahomey was responding to these outside threats from powerful kingdoms like oil and what have you. So by necessity, they had to train these people. And the female soldiers also had the double benefit of being relatively unusual in that area for the period of time they were used. So there was even an instance mentioned where Dahomey was fighting one of their enemies, and they put the female soldiers to the back but they dressed them as regular male soldiers. And this whole force went out, and the enemies were stunned by how many people there were. And you got to keep in mind that Africans, like anyone else, were pragmatists when it came to military matters. So, like when Brother Card mentioned that they got the firearm, they quickly adopted it. Or if you go back to the ancient time when the chariots show up in North Africa, they quickly adopted it. And it's kind of the people's ignorance that they think Africans were so undeveloped that they just had no idea what to do with anything. But if they saw a military advantage or something they could use, they used it just like anyone else would. So getting back to your question, this transition was necessitated by the forces that were around them, as well as the state's own aims to become powerful.
So let's talk about armaments. Let's see if I can find I have a few photos, a few illustrations, of generally how they were armed. If you see here, they definitely have the rifle as a main armament. We have depiction of male Dahomey warriors as also. So we have to let it be known that it wasn't just the females that fought; it was the males that fought. But it was, I guess, it's so sensational to have women fighters, that is what was noted by the British in their fights. They're used to fighting men, but the thought of fighting a woman, I guess, was so memorable to them that they took such notice of it. I want to talk about the weapons. So let's go to the movie. Have you both seen the trailer for the movie?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what do you think about the trailer and how did they get it mostly right? Did they get it mostly wrong?
From what I saw in the trailer, it looked pretty good. I mean, Hollywood's gonna, they're gonna make, little changes and things like that. There's a lot of things, like even when you do like stored combat, there are things that don't show up well when you try to do it 100% the way it's supposed to look. But generally, I got a good impression from what I saw visually, and it was very clear on what they were trying to represent.
Right, and I agree with Brother Carr. I think they did a decent job in the trailer. I would have to see more so of the movie, how the forces are employed, how they're armed, or what have you, to really gauge the faithfulness of it. But at least from the trailer, it seems decent. But again, it's a Hollywood movie, so the rigor that they took in portraying it faithfully, I would have to wait till I saw the whole movie to know for sure.
Okay. All right. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was there's a lot of myth and legend about the Dahomey. One of them is the famed collapsible sword. So I've heard about the Dahomey Warriors had a giant switchblade kind of weapon that they would use, but I have yet to find any evidence of that. That's really only hearsay. I haven't even found any firsthand accounts of that. Have either of you come across that?
No firsthand accounts. I mean, I've seen mention of it, but I haven't seen any.
So where was that mentioned? Was it secondary mentions?
Yeah, I think, if I remember correctly, yeah, it was secondary. There's a mention of it in like the Book of the Sword, talks about it. And that book is interesting though, because the guy who wrote it, I'm forgetting his name, but he makes a lot of like assumptions basically, especially when like it's African stuff that I actually study. So I wouldn't 100% call him a trustworthy source, but he is of the era,
Okay. Yeah, like all of the sources that I have seen that are mentioned, it's always like people say, or it was said that, it's never said by who it was said, like, and then it's like And then when I read about the from British sources, no one ever mentioned that. So I myself am firm believer that that itself is a myth, and that never happened. And it's just kind of un-African, like I've never even seen a collapsible or movable blade in any fashion in African society, especially when the iron itself is often a status symbol. So, why would the status symbol be something that would be hidden away in the handle itself? Normally they're displayed proudly. So personally, I don't think that's truthful. So I know. So Kari, as a member of the historical African martial arts, one of your big things is combat. Any idea how the Dahomey trained? I guess this question is for either of you, but I know Kari has a focus on that. Any idea of how they trained?
So they started. So especially if you're talking about, they were basically increased over time. So they start off kind of like as like special bodyguards, and then they kind of become their own unit, and then at a certain point they start incorporating female captives or unruly women and things like that. They talk about adding to the army, so basically they have a bigger pool, but they would bring in both older women as well as like young girls. They would train. They did things like they would climb like thorn bushes, thorn defenses to kind of toughen themselves up. Running, physical exercise, a lot of dancing. They did mock battles where they would basically pair off and pretend before pre-practice raids. For the higher up ones, they would learn strategy, tactics, things like that. So think of like almost like a modern military camp, like if you join the army or things, the kind of stuff they get you through, where you're training with your weapons, you're doing physical exercise, and you're also practicing some like drill things, as well as like there's a spiritual reinforcement to everything they do. And so you kind of get the same sense of the other warrior societies, like like the samurai or the Spartans or whatever, where they basically this focus on being the best you can be in combat is this all it's an all-encompassing sort of thing, and the society supports them to be able to have that focus totally on becoming elite troops and things like that. And then when it comes to like muskets, because of the way the weapon works, you have to start practicing linear formations and marching in columns and things like that. You see a lot of African warfare. You did like open ranks, but the way that the musket works, it really relies on those really tight units. So being able to employ those, which is something that has to be trained, because that's outside of how traditional African combat looked, especially in that region, which is actually interesting because the area you have essentially above it, you have grasslands where you can have cavalry. And then on the coast, you have an area where you can have navies. And then Dahomey is kind of like in the middle. So, they would go, if they go above them, you have kingdoms like the Oyo that have cavalry that they had a real hard time fighting. But then when you go down into their lands properly, you can't maintain a cavalry because of Tezi fly. So like you have that. And then you have navies when you go down to the coastal region. And from what I've read, like I have warfare in Atlantic Africa, they said that there might have been some issues with gunpowder weapons just in the environment, because they said that when they did Navy warfare, it was more likely for them to use old weapons. And I'm thinking if that has something to do with like powder getting wet or humidity or things like that. But I know that from flintlock to percussion, that was kind of saw more introduction of firearms because there were some illogical issues dealing with certain environments with musketry. So I found it interesting that they said the Marines generally used bows, javelins, and kind of the older weapons, even if muskets were available. But that's a general.
That makes sense.
Right, and then, yeah, even adding to what Brother Carr said, especially an issue with muskets, like if the powder gets wet, or you have to take the time to load it, and these older weapons are way more reliable if the musket misfires. So it's like the gun doesn't really completely supplant a lot of these older weapons till it develops a lot more where it's a lot more user friendly and it's a lot more reliable. I mean, take, for instance, the use of the bayonet, for instance. That was your backup in case you closed in with somebody. You don't have time to load the musket. Excuse me, you don't have time to load the musket. So,
all right, gotcha. So let's talk about some of their enemies. So they started. Who would you say, African-wise, was their biggest militaristic adversary?
The Yoruba.
Yeah.
Especially the Kingdom of Oyo, but some of the other Yoruban territories. I mean, you guys, they literally hated each other for the entirety of Dahomey's existence. And to really give you a sense of how much they hated each other, when the Dahomey had been beaten by the French, some of them had remarked that they would have been able to stomach their defeat had they been able to vanquish the Yoruba, especially at Abukuta, where they sustained a lot of losses.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay. Kari?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. But they were generally like they were at war with everybody. But it's like those states that actually had the ability to combat them, and especially because this thing is not a vacuum. So if they're over there and they're getting, this professional military and they're, increasing the ranks of the Mino, they're increasing the ranks of, the other soldiers in their army. They're importing, weapons and things like that. Everyone else was ramping up too. And so basically those states that were, difficult for them beforehand were still difficult for them afterwards, because what happened was the states that didn't have access to these firearms, that couldn't make these reforms, they lost their territory. And so they talk about basically like migrant groups where they've lost their capital or they don't have their lands anymore. And they're just, we're over here with this group of people hiding out basically, or the army is basically moving around the landscape, kind of like a semi-nomadic kind of situation because they were displaced. And so, so I would say the Yoruba, but basically they're kind of like, they always have to keep up with the Joneses because, people who were getting their stuff taken, and those states were, like I said, it's a very turbulent time period.
Okay. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the depictions that we have of the Dahomey Warriors, and I wish Brother Omri Cope was here because he wrote a fantastic article about I'm gonna call them the fake Dahomeys. So let me pull up the picture here. So a lot of people recognize this photo as a group of Dahomey warriors, the female ones, and these pictures go all over. Let's have a few more here. But according to Brother Amrin Cole, those pictures are not of Dahomey women. Apparently, these are from a Ringling Brothers style sideshow that toured Europe. And these folks were mostly, I believe, Senegalese. And, this is just another way that myths and just complete falsehoods, enter the world of academia and research and are taken as fact. Like I remember a few years ago having a conversation with someone, about the Dahomey Empire and we did like, you can look at the weapons, you can see, because there's also a photo, I couldn't find it, of a mock battle, where these same actors, I'll call them, are in a mock battle, and now that I know that those pictures were staged basically in Europe, those pictures aren't even taken in Africa. Those are Senegalese people for the most part in Europe. It just it completely knocked out his argument, and it would, if I'd have known that, would have completely changed my argument, with him. So that's just one of the other myths about the Dahomey that I wanted to dispel. So from now on, when you see, there it is right there. So this is a mock a battle that they show. Well, you see the men and the women fighting. This is how they fought. No, it's not. It's not how they fought. That is not a true depiction of how they fought. It was indeed staged. So, from now on, if you see those pictures, to all my viewers, I want you to comment, that shit is fake. Let everybody know that's not the truth. So let's talk about their engagement with the European powers. So, one of the sticking points that many people who are obliged to the movie, who aren't for the movie, what they're saying is, the movie shows them fighting, the British, when in fact it was the British who was trying to outlaw slavery, so they're fighting to keep slavery. So let's talk about some of their engagements with Europe, with Britain at the time.
Well, I'll say about the British abolishing the slave trade. I mean, that was purely to hurt their other European rivals because they had industrialized. They were one of the first countries to industrialize, and essentially, before they were doing the mercantilism, where they were having their colonies export, goods and things like that, and they really had this sense of like, me harming my neighbors is going to make me wealthier and more powerful. So when the British didn't really need the slave trade system anymore because of the way that they had reformed their society, that's when they looked to ban it, basically. Up until that point, they were on board. But if the Spanish and the French and stuff can't get access to all this free labor, that benefits me, because I have factories and things like that. So I feel like that's kind of, you're missing a historical context because, like, I wouldn't even frame it like that. But then the other thing is the relationship is kind of, common of what you see with the other people who traded with the Europeans, where essentially you go from them wanting to trade with you to basically, after Berlin Conference and things like that, they start trying to put more and more influence onto your lands, sending, like they talk about, like, we go like South Africa, sending missionaries over, and the missionary gets hurt. Now we can come over with an army because we got to protect our missionaries. So they basically chipped away. And part of that was that while they necessarily couldn't always fight the African armies, so like, like the Dahomey and things, like if they wanted to attack them, they couldn't always necessarily beat them in their lands, especially if they don't have that many people over there. The Europeans controlled the coast, because on the coast they have their giant warships and things like that. They have cannons. And so since they're able to basically have these footholds, they basically can bide their time because they can't really be dislodged. And so what you have is essentially the French continue to put more pressure on the Dahomey state, trying to get advantage of the trade, so the trade is more beneficial for them, things like that. And then they start sending forces into their territory, which ends in 1890. It leads to the first conflict between them because essentially they were violating, even the treaties they had signed with them. The French were continuing to, press into their lands and things like that.
Of course.
So that led to an attack, and that attack was on a fort, and it was on. It was in 1890. I don't have the exact date. I don't have the exact date on me, but essentially the Mino were in that battle. They were able to breach into the fort while under heavy French fire, so that's impressive. But then they were kind of repulsed, and then they fought a second conflict, which essentially, led to the decline of the state. And basically, that's kind of what you see is that you go from, beneficial trade relations to, the European powers putting more and more pressure, which then eventually leads to open conflict. And, if you're buying the guns and things from these people, they're keeping the best stuff for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you're like, we're the most armed, African kingdom in the area, the Europeans, their firearms they're more developed. They have more supply of them. And then, you get later, you start seeing like, artillery pieces and things like that. I mean, Dahomey had 25 cannons, which is noteworthy because like a lot of African states didn't have access to artillery. But compared to a European power, that's nowhere near the amount of firepower they can bring to bear. And so the interactions are kind of like, well, I can make a treaty with you, but I know I can beat you down the line. And that's kind of like you get, you look at these trade deals and stuff, they're every one-sided because, they know that they have that advantage.
Okay. You mentioned the second battle there led to their decline. Don, what would you say would be their greatest victory? What do you think their greatest victory was?
I would probably say it would be over Ketu because that was a Yoruban stronghold, and the Dahomey. This is especially where the Mino really shine because they completely, basically sacked the place, and it was such a blow. And if I remember correctly, Ketu was looked at as a place that was founded by one of the progenitors of the Yoruban people. So this was a very significant symbolic victory for them as well. And it also showed what the Mino could really do against the Yoruba. And then that would have been the point of Aqua Buddha is to also, Aqua Kuta, to also capitalize off of Ketu and strike even further into the Yorubans' territories. But yeah, definitely Ketu, especially as far as the Mino are concerned, is basically their watermark there.
Okay. So okay, well let's I'm still having some technical difficulties, so we're trying to make this as good as entertaining as possible for folks. I mean, we've actually been here for a while. I could continue this discussion on forever and ever. But I would like both of you gentlemen to basically just give us leave us with something personal, something heartfelt, something that you feel that if there's one point that you could get across to the Dahomey Empire, that one point, what would that one point be, Don?
Well, for me, if I wanted anyone to take something away from this, is that when we're looking at history, very rarely are you going to find a perfect person. You're going to very rarely find a perfect society. And you can look at the Dahomey Kingdom, you can look at how advanced they were, and you can be proud of that and also note their complexity, that they weren't all people wearing white sheets who did nothing wrong. And when we recognize this, we can celebrate them without excusing some of the mistakes that for us, they're mistakes now. So just keeping that in mind, making sure that we evaluate Dahomey on its own merits, and really kind of take away the fact that very few people are perfect in history, basically almost no one. And we can examine these people without excusing the things about them that we do not like or agree with.
All right. Kari?
Yeah, like I have a that's like similar to my view on it. I feel like here are people that were dedicated to their group, to their state, to their kingdom, and they did what they deemed necessary to preserve that, and to see them as, you know, a great warrior society, you know, because that's what it was. Like this is a society that really dedicated itself into its preservation and expansion of its state. And I feel like learning the broader complexities of the history doesn't take away from the impressiveness of, here's a state that literally was able to triumph over some enemies that, you know, had plagued them for their entirety of their existence, basically. And then to become so prominent that there's, you know, there's still inspiring media and things even to this day. And so, you know, take the good and the bad, because that's really Absolutely. The only way you can understand, you know, what was really going on and what really was special about them.
All right. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank both of you for being my guests. I learned quite a few things today. I hope that the rest of the Dahomey community did as well. If someone wanted to contact you, Don, how would they contact you?
Easy. You guys can look me up in the Hama group. I post a lot in there. They can add me on Facebook, Don Cooks. Just reach out to me, and I'm always willing to talk to anybody.
Mm-hmm. And for me, same thing on Facebook group. I'm, you know, pretty vocal. And then also I have my YouTube channel, Warrior Sesh, where I'll be posting some cool things.
Okay. All right, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here with me today.
All right. Thanks for having us. You guys take care.
All right. Folks, I want to thank you. Today was a very good topic discussions for everyone that tuned in. If you have any comments or questions, please reach out to us. You can hit us here on Facebook as well as YouTube. You can contact us directly on our website as well. So once again, folks, thank you very much for participating and listening to our chat today. Have a good day.
The Historical African Martial Arts Association's Hero Series celebrates the great military leaders of Africa's past. Order yours today at teespring.com.